Thank you, everyone, for being here. We have some veteran panelists up here today. Thanks for coming back. Cheryl, let's start with you.
Hello.
Cheryl, tell us a little bit about yourself and the illustrious company you work with,
Sure.
and how many people are on your team today?
Sure. So, hello, my name's Cheryl. I head up the people team at Greenhouse. Greenhouse is pushing about 350 people today. My team is about 25. And what was the other thing you wanted me to say?
That's it.
Okay.
And
Perfect.
I would ask, when you started at Greenhouse, how big was the team?
We were 100 people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Gerard.
Lots of growth.
Hello, my name is Gerard Ohen, and I'm currently at Oscar Health. Overall, Oscar Health team size is around 1,100, and I head up the talent acquisition team.
And what was your background before Oscar?
Totally. So before coming to Oscar, I was actually heading up the global talent acquisition team over at Verizon, where we had a global team focusing on technology, enterprise sales, et cetera. There headed up the D&I recruitment as well, from campus, military. And then before that, I was in education, doing consulting in education. And I quickly pivoted to corporate after I realized a lot of things coming out of education, that's another panel, so we're not going to talk about that. So yeah, now I'm at Oscar Health. I've been there for about 3 months.
Great. Thank you. And Liz?
Hi, I'm Liz Wessel. I'm the co-founder and CEO at WayUp. We help companies scale their early career recruitment without scaling their teams, with an emphasis on diversity and candidate experience, specifically focused really on college students and recent grad hiring. We've been around for just over 5 years. We're over 60 employees, mainly based in New York City.
Could I ask you to go back to a story I think you told years ago on a Stacklist panel about why the kind of living in India was instrumental to the conception of WayUp and entrepreneurship?
Sure. The 20-second version is, I knew I wanted to start a company, and when I graduated from college, I went to work at Google for a couple of years, first in California, then in India. And I think the biggest thing that working in India really taught me was I didn't want to start another selfie camera. Not that those are not important to some people's lives, but for me, I really wanted to start something that would make an impact in people's lives. And that's why panels like this are really important to me.
Thanks. Polly, tell us about Unbound.
Yeah, similar to all the HR focus up here, I run a vibrator company, which is basically the same thing. No, I'm kidding. You make people happy, so... No, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Unbound. We're a sexual wellness company. We make vibrators, lubricants, and accessories, which we sell direct to consumer. And we're a mighty team of 10. So but strong.
Let's stay with you. Let's just let's talk more about vibrators.
For therapy.
Why is everyone in the audience is hiring their first, possibly, or fifth hire? Why should they be thinking about diversity and inclusion right now? Why is it important?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because I grew up in the inner city of St. Louis and was constantly surrounded by diversity. And so I think also I don't want it to be focused about me, but I come from a low socioeconomic background. And so half of our team are first generation college students, half of our team are first or second generation immigrants. And I think it's more based on, in startups, you want people who have been put in situations where they have no idea what they're doing, but they have a willingness to figure it out. And so I think innately those first people in your startup tend to be more diverse, because I think in particular people who are coming from families who have immigrated here know that better than anybody. And so on one hand, that's personal bias because it's me hiring based on my own personal account, which is actually what you should not do. But I think it's also the values of our company are just our number one value is resilience. And so one of the first questions I ask when hiring is, tell me about a time that you truly, truly failed. And I'll get some people that are oh my God, one time I got a B+ in my count class and it was so horrible. And I'm okay, cool. But I think which is a little bit of shade on them, but not a lot. I just think you want to find that when you're interviewing first round. I don't know if that's helpful, but.
How do you put scope around it? And anyone feel free to jump in here. When you're talking about diversity and inclusion, how do you put scope around it when you are a 0 to 5 person team? How do you define it? Give it, Liz, yeah.
I'm happy to dig in a little. So we think about diversity in a 2D way and a 3D way. And so two-dimensional is really what you're born with, your race, your socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it might be. These are things that we definitely care about. But we also look at it in a 3-dimensional way. What kind of school did you go to? Did you grow up on a farm or did you grow up in a city? Have you lived around the world or not? And so we really try to look for diversity in a bunch of different ways. I will say, I think I'm a pretty good example of someone who started by not being as focused on diversity recruitment as I should have been. Our first, and this is like a very common theme for most startups out there, our first few employees were through our network because they were people we trusted. Like my first hire was one of my housemates, I would say roommates, but we didn't share a room, but like one of my housemates for college. So of course she was my first hire when she told me that she would be willing to work for me, because I was like, this woman, I know I can trust her. She's amazing. She's brilliant. She's creative, etc. And then the next person was a guy who was really close with one of our investors. And like, lo and behold, our first 4 employees were all white. And then the next employee was white. And so we actually did end up, not to say that a white person can't be friends with an Asian person, can't be, et cetera, but it just so happened that we were using our network at the beginning. And now our company is significantly more diverse. And so I do just want to say that, well, because I think you referenced an earlier panelist said like diversity or whatever is all about like what you start at the beginning. While we've always been 50-50 male-female, it's never too late to start caring about D&I, because it took us probably 1.5 years to start looking at some of the things outside of like gender and school type and start looking at race, et cetera.
What were the things that you did when you started getting more intentional about making that change?
Yeah, so there's something called the Rooney Rule, but it's basically this awesome concept of force yourself to see, like, let's say you really you're struggling to recruit more women. You should force yourself to see at least a certain number of women before you make any offer for any candidate. And so we started doing that when it comes to race. So we started saying, not just all people of color, but like specifically non-white and Asian candidates, we want to see at least X number of candidates for a specific role before we would make a hire. Because guess what? Like, everyone is just as good as one another. It's not like just because you're a woman, you're better than men, or just because you're Hispanic, you're better than white, or anything like that. For us, it was just, we were struggling to get them into the funnel. And so we just had to work a lot harder to get them in the funnel, because at the end of the day, there are less African-American software engineers in New York City than there are white software engineers in New York City, but they're still there, and you just have to work a little harder to get them. That's one example.
Thank you. Cheryl, at Greenhouse, how do you put definition and intention around diversity?
Well, so there's a couple things. I want to talk a little bit about kind of the high level theory of it, and then a little bit about the tactics, and I'll try and be brief on both. With DE&I in general, we kind of have historically, and maybe in the beginning not so intentionally, broken it down into efforts around equity efforts around inclusion, efforts around diversity. And so very early in our time at Greenhouse, we very intentionally started looking at market data to make sure we were paying men, women, and people of different ethnicities the same, and based on market value. That was something we did really, really early on, and it served us really well, because I think a lot of companies don't do that until later, and then they're trying to untangle a bunch of inequity that they accidentally built in along the way. Around diversity, about 3 years ago, we actually, I would call it an initiative. We launched an effort to look at what our numbers are at Greenhouse, and set some targets. And it's a hard thing when you're trying to increase diversity in your company. You don't want to set targets. It feels gross. And so we set our targets around moving away from homogeneity. So moving away from homogeneity in ethnicity and gender across both management and staff. That's actually something that we're looking at revisiting. We set it up a while ago. Some of our targets, I think we could be a little more ambitious now. And then around inclusion, about 2 years ago, we started doing an inclusion survey through a company called Culture Amp. Probably a bunch of folks here have heard of them. They have a great inclusion survey. Folks self-identify into probably like 10 or 11 different demographic groups. And so it gives you a lot more data than you get when you do a traditional survey and you're kind of limited to EEOC data or something like that. So that's kind of like the 3 buckets of initiatives that we've had. When we talk specifically about hiring, obviously we support structured interviewing and structured hiring at Greenhouse. For those of you who don't know, that's our product. As I was listening to the panelists talk about how they've built it into their process, I think when you're a very tiny startup, it's really challenging for the exact reasons that you talked about, right? Like you're just trying to stay alive. Like whoever is willing to come work for you, it's probably somebody that you know. It's probably somebody that looks a lot like you. I think it can be really difficult to introduce diversity into your company early on. And it is so fundamentally important to do it early on because it just gets harder if you don't. And so I think for those of you who have smaller companies and maybe something super structured and really heavy is hard to put together and you're just trying to keep your head above water, maybe try focusing on the attributes that you're trying to hire for and not focusing on things that maybe have some bias built into them fundamentally. So if you're somebody that really likes hiring people from Harvard, maybe think a little bit about like how that's serving you, which is not to say there are not people from diverse backgrounds at Harvard, but if you went to Harvard and they went to Harvard, it's likely that you've had a similar experience. So think really hard about like what are the things that you are trying to hire for to make the person successful in the role, and then start, I think when you're that small, the thing to do is start being aware of where you have unconscious bias or maybe not unconscious bias in the things that you're looking for the people that work with you.
Gerard, yes.
So back on the question on scope, it's interesting. So at Oscar Health, our mission is essentially to make healthcare more accessible through offering insurance that's easy and simple. And so fundamentally, we have members, and we ultimately want to offer services and products to our members. And we feel really that our employee base has to reflect our membership base, so that we know what kind of needs are out there. So we do look at more demographic data externally as well, the markets that we're going into as a benchmark, and see, are we reflective of that respective market as well? So that's just one of the ways that we actually scope it out.
Interesting.
Versus coming up with a number that we think is a pie in the sky number, which I think some companies do, and that leads them down the wrong path.
And so how then, how do you go about achieving this, in your role?
So I'm on the recruiting side, so I'll talk more from that lens. But in general, there's a lot of publicly available data on whether it's census data, whether it's labor statistics data that actually tell you by MSA, which is essentially a region within a state, what the actual population makeup is. And you can use that to help actually build what your target or threshold should be. And I think that's really important to have a more outward focus versus thinking, if there's someone in the company that feels that, we should have 50% X versus Y, I always ask the question, why is that, right? I'm a firm believer that data should influence all decisions. In God we trust, all else bring data. So the data should really be the cornerstone for how you're actually building your diversity strategy.
I like that. And you're referencing this as, you kind of have a specific reason. You're saying why diversity and inclusion are important at Oscar. I'm sure there are more. And I want to know from the panel, I think Polly said something earlier about it being a representation of people who have hustle, it being correlated with people who can survive in startup circumstances. What are some of the other reasons that this should be a priority at the early stage? Just because we know that it's right from the news, or we put a panel up here today. Why should we deeply value this?
I'm not going to recite a million stats, but literally every study that has ever been done on diversity has shown that companies that have more diversity, and that's both gender, race, types of schools, rural and urban mix, and so on. Literally every slice, the companies that have more diversity perform substantially better than the companies that have less. No matter what way you slice it, it's proven, it's done. It's why, if I told all of you, I have a secret to make you 50% more likely to be successful, wouldn't you be like, what's the secret? I'm going to do it. Well, that's it. That's one of them. There's other things too, don't spend all your money. But I think it's one of those no-brainers. If you're just purely being selfish and not trying to help the world.
just not being a good person. We're just being comprehensive here, making sure we're covering. Were there other things you wanted to add?
Aside from the fact that, at Greenhouse, we believe it's important just as human beings and as good stewards of life in the world, and everything that you said, it's like countless studies that show the benefit to the bottom line to have diversity in your talent pool.
So, Gerard, let's stay with you on this. When it comes to the kind of culture once someone joins the company, what kind of does Oscar have any practices, or have you experienced practices at other companies that are helpful in making it a diverse and inclusive culture outside of the specific hiring scenario?
Yeah, totally. So I want to go back to the question there. In addition to the stats and all the taglines out there about having a diverse and inclusive workforce, it's much easier to actually build it than to fix it. So if you actually start off with a diverse mindset ingrained in the DNA of your leadership team, holding the team members accountable, it's much easier to grow from there than it is to not have a diverse team and then have to reverse engineer it and fix it later on. That feels really icky to do it from that angle. So I just wanted to drop that in there as well. So in terms of culture, I'm more on the recruiting side, but from a culture perspective, a few things that we're doing, obviously having someone that's really focused on diversity and inclusion, ensuring that we have a strong and representative and sponsored employee resource group. It's important that it's both having them and having executive sponsors for your ERG programs.
And so an executive sponsor to do?
Yeah, so for example, we have an organization called Melanin, and it's to support persons of color at Oscar Health, and we would have an executive sponsor that would essentially either sponsor events with them, show face, offer support in many different ways, and that's really important. And I've seen that as a critical success factor for building culture, is really that top-down sponsorship. So there's a few ways that we're actually doing it in addition to the hiring. So we have an apprenticeship program. We partner with a lot of affinity groups out there that grant us access to this talent. And I can go down the list of the hiring things, but I think that might be another question. So I don't want to steal a thunder. But yeah, those are some of the things we're doing right now.
Yeah. Polly, do you have practices at Unbound that help promote a more diverse culture?
I mean, I think of like culture and people is very different. I think in terms of culture, I think one of the most helpful things that I've ever heard another person say was actually Marissa Mayer from Yahoo. I don't know if she's still there, but
I don't think so.
Oh, okay, well. I think founders, in terms of just speaking to like culture and like how do you cultivate it and et cetera, she told this story about how when, she's very type A and like all the stuff where it's like, let's go do team building. She would just sit there and be like, when the hell are we gonna be done with this? And I think founders tend to feel that way because you're constantly thinking about like the top line and the bottom line and like, are we gonna have enough money to make payroll? I don't fucking know. And so it's like, you're out supposed to be getting beers and you're like, none of you know the pressure that is on me. And like, she brought up this really great point of it's in those moments that are invaluable. And I like went home and I like thought about it. And then the next day I like was just like, guess what, guys? We're all gonna just like play hooky today. We're gonna go out, we're gonna go to Dave & Buster's, and we're gonna just like have fun. And it was in those moments where people felt like they could share more on their personality and their story and who they are and what makes them who they are, because they felt like they were able to connect with the other people on their team in an environment that isn't about work. And so I just, from that point forward, really prioritize every month doing those things out of office that kind of at the surface may feel like a waste of time because they're not generating money, and in fact they're costing you time and money, but in the end really build your team in a way that like you just can't do in the office. And so I'd encourage you to like play hooky every once in a while.
Yes, it is true that like a healthy culture is kind of inseparable, hopefully at the end of the day, from a culture that is also inclusive and diverse. And does anyone else have culture reflections?
Yeah, so I guess we're in between the sides of like not being big enough to do ERGs, which stands for employee resource groups. So like if we had an employee resource group, it'd probably only be a few people. And so I think that our team has so far said like, let's not do that quite yet. But also having like a hooky day for Dave & Buster's were a little bit too big for that, especially with like all the sales folks on our team who can't just cancel all their meetings for a day. Like that's them hitting their quota and not being able to bring home commission that month or quarter, and that's important for them. And so for us, we're in between the size. So some of the things we do, although I love that idea when we were smaller, that would have been awesome. So some of the things we do, we pay for lunch every Wednesday, and it is a mandatory required, you must show up. You cannot come late and just take the food and run. And the reason is because you're supposed to sit at lunch tables with the other people and like hang with them. We do happy hour once a quarter, but we try to also do like non-alcoholic related happy hour type things. And then we also do a culture committee. So this is a good one that we started doing once we were 30 people, and we're still doing it now in the 60s. And I can't recommend it enough once you guys hit your 20 to 30 people. It's like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, I think ours is 8 now, people who all are just really passionate about bringing the fun to the culture and bringing the D&I and like especially the inclusion part to the culture. And so they will do, for Women's History Month, they'll bring in like all kinds of speakers who are incredible women that you've never heard of, but who are just behind the scenes badasses to go speak. I mean, you know, there's like a month for everything or a day for everything. We invented one of those days, National Intern Day, so I feel like I'm to blame too. But there's a holiday for everything, and they'll choose different holidays. So there's one that's like International Food Day, and so they have everyone at the company bring, like literally make, and this you can do with 5 people, make a dish from their childhood. So we had everything from empanadas to jambalaya to matzo ball soup and so on and so forth. And that was so cool because we each had to write a little blurb next to the dish we brought, and people made a lot of food and next to the dish we brought. And so a lot of people had never had matzo ball soup and didn't know what matzo ball soup was. And so I got to kind of share that because my mom also never cooked except for matzo ball soup. So I also even got to share and I was raised by a single mom, and they got to learn a lot more about me. And so I think those are little things that cost you next to nothing and that you can do without being too disruptive as well.
Gerard, if you're comfortable sharing, as a professional of color in the workplace, what practices are kind of moot and what actually makes sense? I mean, I'm sure some things are kind of BS at the end of the day, and some things actually matter. Can you enlighten us about what matters that you see managers and founders do?
Well, I can't speak for the entire population, but I can talk. No worries.
I'm sorry if I implied that. I didn't.
I wish I could. I'll be, in a different position. But in terms of me specifically, me personally, as a person of color, it's really about just being genuine and authentic. Having efforts that seem staged just doesn't really connect with me. So I think that's number one. And then also values. One of the things that I'm kind of hearing as a theme throughout is values. And I think as a company, having values early, refining them, revisiting them is really critical, because then you can use those values and look at all the things you're executing through the lens of those values. So spending time on creating those values is really important. For example, we have 6, and one of them is genius without grit. So when we're doing the hiring, we make sure that we look for folks that, of course, are smart, that are scrappy, willing to actually roll their sleeves up and get it done, and that are not. There's another word that we're using in there in the values, but jerks is another word for it. And that's really important. And we reinforce that through, all hands meetings that we have on a monthly basis. Well, actually, now it's biweekly basis, and daily thoughts, where leaders have to contribute to what they're seeing in the business and reinforcing those values and how they're doing it personally. So it's a matter of doing the social, having the values, reinforcing them through communication, and having that genuine, authentic interactions. And listen, if there is not an expert in the actual company for D&I, or the company just doesn't have it right, it's okay to say that, right? I'd rather hear leaders say, hey, listen, we're working on this, we're trying to get it right, versus pretending like it's all perfect, right? So from my personal perspective, Gerard Ohen from New Jersey, that's what matters to me.
I think something that I add to this too is, a lot of our companies are really white and really male. And if you are kind of looking around at your company, and maybe if you're a member of a majority group and you haven't, and I'm thinking specifically, right, once you get larger, you can do cool things like culture committees and inclusion task force and all those cool things. But when you're a lot smaller, I think it's really important to take the time to educate yourself about what it means to be a member of a majority group and how, and the ways in which maybe things that feel like their default behavior, default culture, default values for you and your team aren't. They are as much a culture and as much a way of being as it is for groups who are maybe members of minority groups. And so there's tons of books you can read. A lot of people have spent a lot of time writing about this for white people, writing about it for men, writing about it for people of majority groups to help them kind of understand the ways in which we kind of, as a white person, like the way that I think I'm normal. Like I'm normal for me. I'm not, it's my reality. I'm not normal for, somebody who maybe looks different from me or grew up somewhere different from me or had a different experience or different economic background. And so especially if you're small, taking the time, if it's just you and your founder or you and like a handful of folks, like take the time, ask your team to read a book like White Fragility or White Rage or Waking Up White. Like there's all kinds of books out there that can really help educate you and change kind of like subtle things about the way you work day to day that if we're talking about building an inclusive environment are really going to make a fundamental impact for you as you grow.
I think that sometimes there are red flags, and I think we were talking about this in, the must-haves you might put on your job description that Michelle said earlier you should be cautious of. You have to have gone to Harvard, or hiring primarily within your network, leaning to homogeneity. Are there any other red flags? Because I guess what I'm thinking of is like subtle things to be conscious of as a mom, and I don't think that puts me in a minority, but I look and I see, a lot of a team meeting happening in the evening, and that tends to, that can exclude the women on the senior team sometimes who are more likely needing to get home. And I just wonder if there are any other things you can throw out that you might have discovered along the way that might help, kind of warn founders against those things.
I mean, so many. Like there's so many. It's a forever laundry list. And I think one of the things that we've discovered at Greenhouse is like it's hard. Like you can't know what's gonna land or not for every single person on your team. But if you take the time to ask and care, you can't make the same mistake 50 times, but you can make it once and learn and do something differently. And so, the inclusion survey that I mentioned earlier is really great for us because it gives us a little more of a democratic view of what's going on in the company and how people feel about different things. But yeah, just ask. If you're not sure, just ask. You're going to stumble. Yeah. Everybody's going to stumble. Like this is one of those topics that you have to just kind of be brave, know you're going to mess up, pick yourself up, dust off, try again.
And I think that's, Gerard, I think when you were mentioning values is something, if a good value is at the core, that's helpful.
I think I fully agree. Just ask, and to a point where, so I was in a group of CEOs and we were all talking about this, and I by the way, this is not going to end in advice. It's just going to end in more confusion. And so we all agreed that in your first year as a parent, like being able to be offered flexible work from home is really important after you get back from maternity or paternity leave. And then, of course, like one of the founders was like, well, I just want to say, as a parent, if you are working from home and you do not have a nanny, you will not be working, because if there is a 6-month-old child, like you are going to be paying attention to that 6-month-old child. So I think you need to also require proof that there is some kind of nanny there. And at first I was like, you're literally requiring almost a doctor's note. That sounds so unreasonable. But then everyone started talking about how it's actually like the most reasonable. And so it all just ended with like utter confusion. And so at my company, similar to what you were saying, we do use Culture Amp. And by the way, for startups that are small, the great version of that is Google Forms, anonymous version. And that's what we used to do. And so you can just send out a Google form and ask people who are parents or who are thinking about, or just everyone, because everyone might want to be a parent one day, maybe not, who knows, but you don't want to lose them because they are thinking about it. And so we just started asking questions, and it was absolutely unbelievable to see what the response was, and now we're starting to take action based on that. Because the last thing I'll say is on this is, in Culture Amp, one of the things you can survey on is, do you think our benefits and comp and equity packages are fair? And it's probably my least favorite question in Culture Amp, because it's just like yes or no, basically. And that just gives no color, because equity, benefits, and comp are all very different things. So we decided to create a version of that that's an entirely own survey, because we kept thinking people are upset about comp whenever they rated it low. And it turned out a lot of the people who are expecting to be moms were saying, I don't love our maternity policy. And so now guess what we're doing? We're redoing the maternity policy, and we're getting anyone who wants to get involved to help us, and so on and so forth. So I fully agree with you, like asking your team, because every company is going to have something different.
And coming back to why it's so important to have diversity in your organization, like if you don't have a parent in the room when you're making decisions about parental leave, if you don't have, I don't know, you can imagine, like play that out into all the different ways that if you don't have a diverse perspective, a diversity of perspectives in the room when you're making decisions about your business, you're going to make less well-informed decisions. And so when you're talking about why it's important, like that's a big one.
And in general, your ideas won't be as good. Yeah. Tactically, I am a founder. I want to prioritize diversity at every level, or in certain ways, like in the first 5 hires. How do I go about doing that? Where do I go? I want the best talent. I want the best team, and that means a diverse team. What advice do you have?
I think for me, because we're a sexual wellness company, we really struggled to get investors to even meet with us. And so my only option was to like insert myself into every networking environment possible. And I think organically and 95% of the time I was really uncomfortable. Like I was traveling to like Baltimore, like all these crazy cities to just try and pitch in competitions that would have me. And I think as a result, my network grew in ways I could have never imagined. People that I would have never ordinarily become friends with, I became friends with them. And so our team is incredibly diverse. I mean, we're all women, so like not as diverse probably as we could be, but I just think you have to try harder than you are, to be honest. And I think a lot of that as a founder means showing up in environments where you don't feel comfortable. And I think it means probably hiring someone who doesn't meet all the requirements. Every single person on our team has never done the job that they're doing today. And I actually think that that is our like best defensibility, is because they are looking at it totally differently, and because they got a massive, and I'm not saying that it's like good for us, I'm just saying like somebody who is running all of our operations was a CX associate at their last job. And so I think when you give people opportunity, 9 times out of 10, they're gonna rise to the occasion.
So Polly, what were the qualities you were looking for that brought this team to you?
I mean, well, one, there's a little bit of self-selection bias because of what we do. Like, you know, you're not going to get like a Donald Trump supporter like applying where we work. You just won't. And so I think that there's that. And then I think that there's a lot to your, and we're consumer facing, so it's also different because like our brand, in the early days, your brand is just a reflection of who you are as an individual, whether you like it or not. That's just kind of the way it is. And so I think because of the values that were embedded into our brand, which the number one value is intersectional feminism, like it just kind of attracted people that had those values to our company. Mm-hmm. And so unlike a lot of my friends that are in B2B startups, which it's a lot harder in those environments because your values aren't as transparent, they have to work harder to like share those values and make them prominent. Because for us, like you could look at our Instagram following and know in our Instagram content and know exactly what we're all about. And for B2B businesses, it's a lot harder. So I can only speak to my experience, but that's pretty much it.
That's great. Gerard.
Yeah, in addition to that, I think I try to follow a framework, so I call it 1+3. So number one, you were talking about it before, establishing your values and really establishing your true identity as a company, because that's really, at that size, that's really all you have. You may not have the marketing dollars, et cetera. That's that one piece. And then I look at the source for talent, right? So where does this talent live, work, and play? And with social media, we have way more access to the broader population without having to pay for a job board, et cetera. cetera. So knowing where to go, where the talent is, there's a number of, meetup groups out there. This is for recruiting as well, right?
Yeah,
Specifically,
yeah.
right? So meetup groups, affinity organizations, general meetups, schools, and they want to hear from companies, right? They have talent that actually would rather work for a smaller company than these large Fortune X companies. The second one is more about the communication, or I call it engage. So what you say and how you say it that's really important. So job descriptions, how's your job description written? Are you actually highlighting the things that are aligning with your values and with the values of that particular population? And the last, but certainly not least, I think you were mentioning it, the close, which is essentially everything dealing with the assessment and selection process, having objective criteria for selecting talent, having behavioral-based questions. I know there's a lot of AI and machine learning data out there that says that they can predict someone's ability to retain and to grow. However, studies do show that behavioral-based questions are probably the best indicator for future success, et cetera. So asking questions that typically start with "tell me about a time" usually lend to be more successful in predicting someone's ability to do that respective job. And whenever I hear something like from interview notes, hiring manager, someone said, "Well, we just clicked." That's usually a red flag. We just clicked. I really liked him. I really liked her. So I always say, "That's great. Tell me why."
Yeah.
And then tie that back to the actual qualifications of the job. So there's a number of things that you can do, but that's kind of how I break it down, looking at, where to go to find the talent, free as well, how to actually communicate. And then lastly, once you get the hook in them, how are you actually assessing their skills versus anything else?
The point that you made about behavioral questions being a better guide of success in finding a good fit. So what would be, can you help us with a counter example? So what is the question that's like not behavioral, or that is more of a dangerous question?
I think we could take a survey, because we've all been asked those questions. This is what I've heard, not from our current company. Just disclaimer, right? Your favorite color. What I heard this one actually at a conference. Someone said, what if you were an animal? What animal would you be? And then this particular leader felt that was an opportunity to see if someone was aggressive, was able to kind of be resilient. And so I'm not going to say the person or the company, but that was very telling.
And I wasn't clear on that detail when you said that before. So that's what you mean by the counter to behavioral questions.
Yes.
That's great. And I'm going to say that that's probably shown up on people's interviews, like in this room. And
totally.
But
how many ping pong balls can you fit into this airplane?
What is with those?
And folks are
we
still
want
asking
to
those
see
questions.
how you think through these. I think that's what they say. They want to see how you think
but
through
it's
the
just
questions.
like, what about somebody who doesn't do well with weird anxiety-inducing, non-practical scenario? What if you've never played ping pong?
I think that's, a great question. I mean, how do you create an interview environment in which someone is able to display their best, which is what you want and what they want?
I mean, I think when we've said it a couple of times on the panel, think about what you want the person to do and then ask about it. And it sounds funny, but it's true. So often, Google is famous, not so much anymore, I think, but back in the day, they used to have these brain teaser questions because they wanted to see how people solve problems. And cool, if that's their job, that's a great way to test them. But if you are trying to hire somebody to be a customer success person, ask them how various customers in their lives, whether it's been a formal customer of a company or somebody that they've just supported maybe as an intern or something else, how they treat and deal with those. It'll give you a much better sense of what you're getting.
Yeah. I mean, spot on. One more thing on that. I literally was working with a hiring manager, and they were having a difficult time identifying competencies, and that's essentially attributes of someone's, ability. So I said, all right, let's take the scientific aspect out of this. All right, what are some of the good things that you see your employees doing? and tell me about what are some of the things that they experience on a daily basis. Okay, they interact with customers. They're leading a team. Okay, now what does leading a team well look like? Well, they're communicating frequently and often. They're giving good feedback. Okay, well, all right, let's talk about giving feedback. If you want to assess someone's ability to actually lead a team and give feedback, let's craft a question around that. All right, so tell me about a time in which you had to give feedback to an employee that wasn't performing, and then the light bulb went off, right? So then they tucked away their question about, what color shoelaces do you have? So it was a quick win there, but it was not only giving them a question bank, but also teaching them how to fish as well. Yeah. So now they're more likely to approach it with that from that angle versus a random question from Google.
Yeah.
My favorite question to ask hiring managers is how is your organization going to be different in 3 to 6 months because of this person? Mm-hmm. It really forces them to dial out a little bit, think about business impact, and really helps them focus in on what they need for the role.
Yep.
Liz, you know something about sourcing candidates for jobs. How do you have any advice for founders who want to prioritize this in their first 5 hires?
Yeah, I do want to quickly just say on the screening front, something that we did not do until we implemented Greenhouse, which we probably did around like 10 or 15 employees, which is probably pretty standard, right? And until then, we didn't do it. And my advice to you is don't do what I did, like basically make a spreadsheet version or a Google form version of for yourselves of Greenhouse until you become that 5 employees or whatever, and then you should implement it. But have a list of questions for your role and ask every candidate the same list of questions. And it's fine to obviously go down different tangents with a candidate based on their experience, but we did not do that. Like our first engineering hire, we asked this candidate very different questions than this, and then this, and then this. And so then by the time you're on your 4th or 5th candidate, you might be a little exhausted, you might be making it a little easier, or you might just be letting your biases, you're completely unconscious and not on purpose, but you're going to be letting your biases play a big part. So I do think having questions, that's what she meant by structured interviewing, but I feel like a lot of people out of HR might not know what that means.
Everyone in this room does, because we just had a presentation on structured hiring.
Then do it.
From Ariana.
Yeah. And you could start training yourself. And if you're at 1 employee, you don't have to buy Greenhouse at 1 employee. You could get it at 10, but like you can start training yourself to get there via spreadsheets and Google Docs until then. And I'm a big fan of Greenhouse, just to be clear. I'm just saying it might not be economically feasible for everyone when you're 1 employee. And then in terms of sourcing, so for early career talent, that's such a big opportunity to bring in people of different color, gender, background, et cetera, because realistically, anyone you hire is going to have very little experience. And so this is such an unfortunate thing that this is still the case. But as I mentioned, there are more senior engineers in New York City who are white or Asian than who are Hispanic or Black. And so as a result, it is harder to find those. But when you're looking at early career, you don't need to look for the senior experience, the 10 years of experience. So you can over-optimize for really emphasizing. And that's why a big part of what we do at WayUp, we're focused on early career, but that's why so many companies use us for diversity, because they're like, you know what? We're struggling to get more diverse talent at the top because it's just really hard to find it, but we believe we can cultivate them from the bottom. And if we're going to hire someone with no years of experience, we might as well look for the most diverse and best people out there as opposed to just who has the most experience. So I think looking for diversity and early career is a really big opportunity. And obviously I'm happy to give anyone here free access to WayUp. If you just email me, liz@wayup.com, I can hook you up with our SMB person. And but we only do early career, just to be clear. So.
There's an extension of that, though. I mean, I speak with probably a few founders a month who express frustration around this topic, and they'll say, I can't seem to find someone of color, an African-American engineer for my engineering team. And not one of them has ever posted to a historically Black institution or a college. And so it just seems like there are some, now, I don't know, maybe some of them don't have engineering but I just don't know why that's something that everyone misses. And I think that really goes to, what WayUp is doing or kind of nipping that in the bud. But I think there are some pretty obvious pieces of low-hanging fruit around. I would also suggest hammering your board. If you have investors, advisors, and you need help with this, shout it from the rooftops, and it should be their responsibility as well.
One thing on investors, though, just really quick, and I made this mistake, is they will pressure you because they're so scared you're going to fail too. They'll pressure you to hire somebody that did this at Netflix or whatever. And like, that is such a big founder trap because you're so self-conscious. Like, I actually find investors tend to be problem children a lot of the time when it comes to diversity and inclusion, because let's be honest, most of them are white men anyways. And so, yeah, just don't be afraid to push back on investors when they're like, hire this guy. He grew, Warby Parker from X to Y, which is great. I'm glad that he did. But that is a trap that I see a lot of founders falling into. So, yeah.
That's great advice. Do we have any questions? Some in the back. Can you raise your hands? Or yeah.
Hey, I don't know how to ask this in a clear way, but the way the nation seems to be changing, it seems like lack of inclusion and lack of diversity is like a trend. And so if you're going to try to have political inclusiveness in your company, how do you go about that? Do they just have to stay within the guardrails during the day, and then what they do on Twitter at night?
Are you talking about like we're in New York City right now, so odds are it's a fairly blue. But I mean, not necessarily everyone in this room agrees. I happen to be on the bluer side. Are you asking about how a politically charged environment, how to handle that, or are you asking something else?
I'm asking if you're trying to, like, all these categories of inclusion that you're trying to tick off, right? Race, socioeconomic background, and then political leanings comes in that. If like close to 40% of the country is, in the red camp, and a certain subset of that 40% is not a fan of diversity or inclusiveness. How do you bring them onto your team and have them play nice, or do you bring them onto your team? Do you just say, nope?
I can address this one a little bit. Because Google, my former employer, dealt with this, where there was a man who you guys might remember who posted very publicly within Google about how women, if you guys didn't know, women are actually not as good engineers as men, apparently. And so it's biological. It's something about what's in our hair or our skin or something, but apparently that's the case. And they fired him. And I really stood by that decision. And when I thought about it in my own circumstances, one of our absolute, it's not even written as a principle because it's just so obvious. It's, do you breathe air, and do you believe that everyone in my office is equal? And if you don't feel that way, then you might as well not breathe air in my office, because that's just one of our, it's not even a principle. It's table stakes. And so that's how I would agree on, that's how I would preface I don't need to hire the people who don't believe everyone in my office is equal. And the reason is because it's going to make people uncomfortable. People in my office are not going to want to come into my office if the person next to them believes that they should be in the back of the bus or whatever. What I will say, though, on the political stance, this is shifting the conversation a little, but this was something that was a really hot topic for me when, right after Trump won, there were obviously a lot of laws that were trying to get passed with DACA and with so many different things that were really stressful, and people at my company wanted to speak out every day, and they wanted us to speak out as a company every day. And suddenly you started seeing every big tech company speaking out and signing pledges and doing that about every topic. And so every time I got to have the honor of meeting some tech entrepreneur, tech CEO who I really admired, like a Tim Cook or a Larry Page or whatever, I would ask them, my first question would be, how do you decide when to speak up publicly? And the thing that everyone kept saying was, there's never a right answer to this. And I remember I asked this to Indra Nooyi, who was the CEO of Pepsi, and she was like, we have this debate at our exec team almost every exec meeting, and we always want to speak up, but what we decided, and this seemed to be the trend among all these executives, was what they decided was, speak up when it's clear that that company will be respected in that conversation because they have a right to speak up. So for example, if Oscar Health is speaking up about any laws that are related to health, you're gonna listen. But if Oscar Health speaks up about our city's pothole system being, rejuvenated or something, you're probably not gonna care what Oscar Health has to say about that. And so at least at my company, what we've become really vocal about is a lot of the Department of Labor laws that have been passing under Trump's administration that have just completely, this panel could go on and on. We talked about EEOC. Like, there have been insane laws that you don't even realize are being passed right now. And those are some of the things that we're speaking out about because we know people will listen. But I'm not going to speak out about healthcare because publicly, because I just know we're not going to be listened to.
It's not such a far tangent from this panel to mention that Oscar Health the CEO of Oscar Health, or one of the founders, is a pretty noted advocate, an activist in New York, Josh Kushner, and he is the brother of Gerard Kushner. So I think that if there's something to look at there, I don't know what their dynamic is anymore, but anyway, how people embody the political tension right now is important. And is there another question?
Thank you so much. This has been really, really informative and interesting. So I think, for example, I've been in a lot of professional environments where superficially it looks really diverse, but it doesn't feel inclusive. And I'm wondering, after the recruiters have done their great job of bringing people in, what are the concrete things that companies and perhaps early stage companies can do so that people don't feel like they need to check their full selves at the door and that the company can actually maximize the benefits of their diverse background?
I have two thoughts right away. One is just repeating the thing I said earlier, educate yourselves about what majority cultures look like and the ways that you are subtly imposing those on people from minority cultures that come into your organization. And that's literally reading books and articles and things. And the second I would say is super, super tactical and very specific, but it's always the thing that pops to mind for me first. There's lots of information out there about how to create more inclusive meetings. This is so specific. It can be so impactful to your business, especially if you're small, just to make your meetings a more inclusive place to participate. Making sure that people can speak, making sure that people take turns speaking, making sure that people are mindful of the questions they're asking and how they're asking them. And it's really simple stuff. If you have a distributed team, have everybody log into your Zoom or whatever else it is that you're using so that everybody's on equal footing in terms of having a conversation in the room. If you rotate meeting facilitators. So you have a recurring meeting every week, have every single person take turns facilitating that meeting. It's little tiny stuff, right? And this is one of the things we talk about a lot at Greenhouse. We have a whole part of our product is built around it. The little nudges in the way you work every day are actually the things that are the most impactful. The big, sexy, we're having an inclusion event, it's probably pretty fun. And changing the ways you work, checking your job description to make sure you're not using gendered language, making sure that you're thinking about how a person of color might read a job description when you're writing it, or how a particular question might be rooted in your own specific culture, or a number of other things, both in your hiring process and the way you work day to day. Those are the things that actually make an impactful difference for people.
Thank you all for being up here. This is a hard topic, and it's wonderful to have your insights. So thank you very much.